Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Welcome. Welcome to Moog Fest of the North, or Electronic Music Comes Home. 3 days of events celebrating the life and legacy of Robert Moog. So we have lots of things planned for you. Let me just tell you a little bit. First of all, we have the official sponsors of the event, which are all listed here, so I don't have to read it all. So we'd like to thank those people. I would also like to thank Judith Periano there, sitting in the audience, professor in the music department, Professor Roger Mosley, who's somewhere out there, and Catherine Reagan from the Rare Manuscript Department of the Library. These are the people that have been working intensely, particularly Judith, on organizing this event and bringing it off. And we're here mainly, I think, because of the endeavors of Judith in particular. The exhibit, one of the official reasons we're having this event at this particular time is that something known as Robert Moog's archive, the Moog Archive, has arrived at Cornell University. And we thought it'd be, since Bob was a graduate in engineering physics from Cornell University, we thought it'd be nice to celebrate the archive arriving here. And that's what we're doing. One of the main events is an exhibition that opens tomorrow at, what time, Judith, is it tomorrow it opens?
It opens at 5:30.
5:30, there's an opening ceremony in the Kroc Library, and you go into Olin, go right to the bottom, and that's going to be a nice little occasion with wine and so on, and you can have a look at the actual exhibit there. And there's some incredible stuff in the exhibit, old synthesizers, schematics, all sorts of interesting stuff. The sales book from the Moog Company with the sale to the Beatles, the famous sale they made to the Beatles. So later on today, just how we're going to run, this is going to be a panel about Bob. I'll introduce our esteemed guests in a moment, about Bob Moog's legacy and impact on music. We're going till 6 o'clock, and we're going to take questions from the audience. So you've got, I know many of you out there have actually known Bob Moog and have things to say. So we're going to leave at least half an hour for that to happen for you. We've got a microphone here to join in with this celebration of Bob's life and career. At 8 o'clock, we finish at 6. At 8 o'clock, there's a concert organized by Kevin Ernst, his professor of electronic music here at Cornell, and some of his students and an ensemble in Sage Chapel. So I invite you. These events at Cornell are all free, no charge to you, and I invite you to come to that at 8 o'clock. Other highlights, we have the British synth pop person, Gary Newman. And I get emails from people saying, is that really the Gary Newman? Yeah, it is the real Gary Newman. And he'll be giving a talk tomorrow afternoon, 4:30. Judith will be talking with him. I don't know if he's going to give a performance. If we have a synth nearby, maybe we could persuade him. But Gary will be here. We also have Brian Kehoe, who's sitting at the back there, who we welcome him from Los Angeles. He's an expert on Moog history. He's going to give a talk about other sides of Moog, and he's also a talented musician, played in many, many bands, and he'll be introduced properly tomorrow. But the band favorite of his, I love, is Moog Cookbook he played in, which was named, I think, after a book that Shirley Moog produced called Moog's Musical Eatery, which is a book of recipes and stories about Bob Moog. We also have Susie Analog coming, a really cool hip-hop type Moog electronic beat sound. She's coming as well, not only to perform, but she's going to be interviewed here by Catherine Alpert in the music department. We also have Susan Charney coming, a legendary performer. She's going to perform in Sound Around. I just asked you to look at the poster for all the details. Also on Saturday morning, Jordan Acedo and I are running a synth building session, so you can build your own synthesizer. And we have 30 kits. We supply everything. You take it away, and hopefully it works. But we're going to be doing that in Lincoln B20 on Saturday morning. Anything else I should be announcing, Judith, you think?
That covers it.
I think it covers it. Good. So we hope these are enjoyable events for you. You may have noticed, if you've read the details of the program, that there were going to be 3 guests here today. Unfortunately, Albert Glinsky, who's Moog's official biographer and is in the process of writing a biography of Bob Moog, is not here today. He got sick, really, unfortunately, last night and wasn't able to make it here. I'm going to fill in a little bit of the detail. I wrote a book about Robert Moog myself, and so you have to make do with me as the kind of unofficial biographer. And I even have copies of my book, Analog Days, at the back, in case anybody, I thought it was an opportunity to sell some discount copies to you all, if you're interested. We do have a merch table.
What a salesman.
Yeah. So let me just introduce our guest today. Sitting on my left is Michelle Moog-Koussa, who's Bob's daughter. Let me just welcome Michelle first. Welcome to Cornell, Michelle.
Thank you.
It's her second visit, I think, to Cornell, she told me. And let me just say a little bit about Michelle. Michelle Moog-Koussa has been the executive director of the Moog Foundation for the 12 years since its inception. She's guided the organization through the creation and growth of its hallmark educational project, Dr. Bob's Sound School, which inspires thousands of teachers and young children every year for a 10-week experiential science of sound curriculum. Michelle has also maintained her vision for a Moogseum, which has opened, I think, this year in Asheville, a historical and educational center that will house all the Foundation's projects while encouraging people of all ages to embrace the process of scientific and creative discovery. And that museum has just opened. And so we thank Michelle very much for being here. And she is, since she's been director of the Moog Foundation and before, obviously as a member of Bob's family, she's sort of a living testimony, not only in her own memories, but the materials she's collected at the Moog Foundation. And we'll be hopefully drawing on that and her memories today.
Yes.
On my left here is somebody who in these circles probably doesn't need much introduction, but I will read David Borden. Welcome, David. Here's a little bit of his Wikipedia entry. I never know how to introduce people who I know as friends, but anyway, of course, you know he's the founder of the first ever electronic music ensemble, live ensemble, Mother Mallard's portable mobile masterpiece. I'm now screwing up the name.
Portable Masterpiece Company.
Portable Masterpiece Company. We are otherwise known as Mother Mallard. So let me just read from a little bit from his Wikipedia entry. In 1969, with the support of Robert Moog, he founded the synthesizer ensemble, Mother Mallard's Portable Masterpiece Company, in Ithaca, New York. Mother Mallard performed pieces by Robert Ashley, John Cage, Terry Riley, Philip Glass, and Steve Reich. In addition to his work with electronics and the Mother Mallard Ensemble, David Borden has written music for various chamber and vocal ensembles. He's also an accomplished jazz pianist. David Borden was educated at the Eastman School of Music and at Harvard University. At Harvard, he studied with Leon Kirchner and Randall Thompson, and at Eastman with Bernard Rogers and Howard Hansen. He was a Fulbright student in Berlin, Germany, where he studied at the Hochschule für Musik. Borden's compositions are similar, but better, it doesn't say that, but that's my adding, to the repetitive minimalist style of Philip Glass, Steve Reich, and Terry Riley. Borden is also very interested in counterpoint, best demonstrated in his large-scale series of works, The Continuing Story of Counterpoint, Parts 1 to 12. Just also mention that some of the music for The Exorcist was also performed by David Borden. So welcome again, David. So since we're here at Cornell and Ithaca, we're going to go chronologically through Bob's life and his achievements. We're going to spend most of the time dealing with the Ithaca Trumansburg years, because they were actually the most important years in a way, because two of the legendary synthesizers, the Moog modular synthesizer and the Minimoog, were developed in Trumansburg. And I love to tell that to students. It's just amazing to them that these instruments that were sold to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were developed in tiny Trumansburg, of all places. So I thought we'd start with, you notice I've been calling it Moog. And from Britain, everyone in Britain called it Moog. We thought it was a made-up name for the synthesizer, Moog. Didn't know there really was until I came to Cornell, a real Bob Moog. And he did care about the pronunciation of his name. I can remember when I went to interview him, he had this little thing on his desk about Moog rhymes with rogue, not Moog rhymes with fugue. So he really did care about it. So my first question to David and Michelle is, Michelle, you're Bob's daughter. So were you aware of it? Was it always called Moog in your family? And were you aware of people calling it Moog? And did that make any difference?
It was always Moog in my family. And My recollection is that I didn't hear people mispronounce it very often. I think that by the time I could recall, we were in communities where the name was known.
Yeah.
So people knew how to pronounce it. It wasn't until I was more of an adult that I fell into my role of gently correcting people.
Yeah. It's a funny thing because when my book came out in England, there was a radio program, the Today Show, every morning, and they were debating for the whole week, is it Moog or is it Moog? And people were calling in, definitely Moog, mate, you know. So I'm thankful for the ambiguity. David, you always knew him as Bob Moog, I assume?
Yes. I met him in 1967. Is my mic on? Okay.
No, you just, yeah.
Now it is?
David Borden is very good with technology, you know.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
the light is on.
There's a green light. It should be red.
No, green is, I think, right? I
No.
think it's,
Now is it on?
No,
it
that's
should be green.
off.
It should be green. Okay.
Green.
Yeah, it's already,
It's up here. Well,
no, turn it to green, yeah.
this
Can you hear him?
reminds me of my first days at the Moog Company.
Yeah, we'll get to that story in a bit.
See, I don't know what you mean.
Oh, it's definitely on. We can hear the.
Okay, that better? Okay, thank you. So I was telling Trevor, this reminds me of my first days at Moog Company. I met him in 1967. I had just come from Berlin the year before, and someone told me about the Moog Company and the studio. And I had no idea of much of anything. I had no science education, but I had a lot of music education. So, so I went up there, and Bob greeted me, and he took me into the studio, and he gave me a little lesson, about an hour. And he would show me how to hook up the Moog Synthesizer, which to me looked like the inside of a cockpit on a big Boeing, passenger plane. I had no idea what it was. And every, 10 minutes or so, he said, "Do you understand that?" And I didn't, but I would always say, "Oh yes, I do," because I didn't want to, I was embarrassed not knowing anything. So at the end of the hour, he invited me to use the synthesizer and come there tomorrow and the next day, and et cetera. So I did. I went there for the next few days, but I couldn't get a sound. And on the third day, I finally said I needed to talk to the head engineer. And Bill Hemseth, who invented the Minimoog, by the way, came down and looked at it. And he was one of those people, and I always thought every engineer is like this. He didn't speak very much. He just said, looked at the setting I had done with all the patch chords. And then he called down another engineer, Chad Hunt, who was equally, nonverbal, and looked at it. And then they called Bob down, and Bob was not like that. Bob looked at it for about 3 seconds and said, "Holy shit." And then I thought I was done there. And then he came over and put his arm around my shoulder, which he usually never does stuff like that, and took me upstairs and had a key made for me and told me, is coming in at night okay? And I said, "That's best, So he said, "Yeah, just come here at night, work as long as you like, and leave it set up, and that'll be fine. You can just do anything you want." So I did that for almost 6 months, and at the end of 6 months, he could tell I actually knew what I was doing, and I was sort of the idiot proofer because I ruined a lot of the modules on the way, and they just redesigned them so that no matter how you hook them up, they would be fine, and no one would ever know it. So that's my early Moog days. And we became lifelong friends.
Yeah, and of course the Moog synthesizer had a reputation for being really amazingly reliable because these rock bands.
These are all modular Moogs too.
Yeah.
And Carlos didn't make his switched on Bach until a year later. So at the end of '68, when that came out, that changed a lot of things. And in 1969, it became a #1 classical music seller. So.
And some rock musicians would tour with the modular Moog, famously Keith Emerson. And he would call, I remember these stories for my book I interviewed Keith, hung out with him a bit, and he would call Bob up in the middle of the night from Japan. And he was unaware, it seemed, of the time difference. So Bob would get these calls in the middle of the night. And my modular Moog is picking up local radio stations. "What do I do, Bob?" And Bob said, "Put silver foil over the whole thing, and maybe that will screen it out." And it screened, Keith said it worked somewhat. But it didn't really matter that much because the voices were kind of cool as well. So let's talk a little bit about where Bob Moog comes from before he arrives in Ithaca. He's
Well, wait a minute now.
no,
There's something interesting about this whole period.
Yeah.
And
we'll get to this period
and
again. I've
Michelle
got.
knows this, too, that he was under immense financial pressure at all times. The company would go up and down and up and down. Is that Jim Scott?
Yes.
Oh, my
Jim
God.
Scott,
it
who
is.
also worked on the Minimoog.
So, so tell the folks about the pressure he had. He had an aunt or something that sent him money every month, and then
Do we want
this
to
and
talk
that.
about that right now, or do you?
Yeah, we're gonna start. Can we?
think-
We
I
get
think-
to that.
Yeah, okay.
You've hijacked it, David.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay though. He's a great story. No, but I think most people here may know something about his origins. But we should ask Michelle. I mean, he lived in Flushing. Was he an only child? Did he have brothers and sisters? Could you tell us a little bit about the family context?
Sure.
Bob was born into?
He was born in 1934 to my grandparents, George and Shirley Moog. My grandfather was an electrical engineer for Con Edison, and my grandmother was a homemaker. They had one child, and as my dad used to joke, he gave me his little silver cup that he used as a toddler, and around the bottom rim, it was all dented. There were probably 50 little dents. And he recalls throwing it down many, many times as a little kid, and he said, that's probably why my parents only had one child. So I guess he was a handful early on, but he was an only child, and he was much doted upon by both parents in different ways. And he showed an aptitude for math and science from a very early age. As early as 9 years old, we have letters from him in our family archive to his great aunt about all of his hobbies. They were almost all science-based at 9 years old, including electrochemistry, among many others. And then by the time he was 10, he was building small electronic hobbyist projects with my grandfather in their basement. My grandfather had an incredible workshop downstairs, somewhat fueled by his own work, but by his own interests as well. And in addition to being an electrical engineer, he was also an amateur woodworker. And this would later come into play because my father eventually stumbled upon making theremins, which are early electronic musical instruments invented by Leon Theremin in 1919. And at that point, he completely fell in love with that instrument, and that instrument would guide him for much of his career, actually. And for those of you who don't know what a theremin is, it's a cabinet that has circuitry inside and two antennae sticking out of the cabinet. Those two antennae control pitch and volume depending on how your hand interacts with the electromagnetic field around them. And notice I said interacts. They never touch. You never touch the instrument. That's kind of part of the big magic of the theremin is you play it without touching it. And my father fell in love with the elegant but simple expressivity of both the circuitry design and the way that it sounds and is played. And he built his first theremin when he was 15. He continued to kind of perfect his own design throughout high school. He was at Bronx High School of Science, and there are records of him performing with it there and exhibiting it in one of the science fairs there. And then by the time he was 19, he was proficient enough at building theremins that he wrote an article for radio and television news that was published in January of 1954, which makes him just about 19 and a half. And at this point, he's at Queens College, and there was such a response to that article because lots of people used to do electronic hobbyist projects before there were such things as iPads and to distract us. And people wrote him and said, you know, where can I get theremin parts? Where can I get theremins? Where can I get theremin kits? And in response to that, he and my grandfather started R.A. Moog Co. out of the basement of their home with providing theremin parts and eventually theremins. My Dad would do most of the circuitry, and my grandfather would build the cabinetry. And for even some of the earliest models, my grandmother would hand type the manuals. So it was very much a family affair.
This is great. A little bit more about the family context, right? So I remember Bob telling me his father was one of the first amateur radio hams in America, and they had an amateur radio set up in this amazing basement that Bob loved. And the other thing that I thought was interesting he told me, and maybe you could comment on, was that his mother insisted on him having piano lessons.
Yes.
So, I mean, it seems that one of the great things here is how an engineer can interact with musicians. So he did have musical background.
Yeah, he started taking piano lessons when he was 4 years old, and Grandma did have very high aspirations for him. She was a big fan of Liberace, and was hoping that her hopelessly geeky, awkward son would someday bloom into such a performer. And so Dad took piano lessons and eventually went to the Manhattan School of Music to study. So he had a long and pretty arduous training. At the Manhattan School of Music, after a while, they offered him the track to become a professional accompanist. So he was good enough to do that. I think that he only thought it would be worthwhile to stay there if he could train to become a professional pianist. So he declined. He said, no, thank you. I'd rather hang out with my dad in our basement, and much to my grandmother's chagrin. I think she was somewhat devastated at that point, but that's when he fully focused his efforts on the theremin. And she was, part of it was that my grandmother was a very domineering figure. And when Dad would practice and he would mess up, she would rap him on the knuckles with a wooden spoon. And I remember reading an article in Grand Royal magazine, which was the Beastie Boys magazine. There was a very long 10-page interview with him, and they questioned him about his piano playing, and he said, yeah, well, my mother gave me piano lessons like you would give someone an enema. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of his conflicted relationship with playing the piano, but he was quite good at it. He did perform in high school at Bronx High School of Science on the piano, and he performed in college. He briefly put a band together, and then he played during at least one summer up in the Catskill Mountains at a hotel, playing dance music for the guests there.
Wow. And the other thing in the family background that we discovered in reading the archives recently, doing letters came out that we didn't know about, was with Aunt Florence.
Yeah.
Now, this aunt was clearly a very significant influence on Bob. Could you say a few words about who she was?
Yeah, when I talk about my dad's inspirations, I would say that there are two main inspirations. One of them was Leon Theremin, and the other one was Florence Moog. Aunt Florence was my dad's aunt, my great aunt, my grandfather's sister. She was a younger sister. She was a zoologist and biologist who was the professor at Washington University in St. Louis for over 40 years. She was educated at NYU and Columbia, if you can imagine that, in the 40s, a woman studying biology and zoology and becoming that proficient. She was quite an exceptional woman who won the Westinghouse Prize for Science when my father was just a teenager himself. She published over 10 different books, and she wrote 3 articles for Scientific American. And the extent of her knowledge and expertise, her accomplishments, and her overall ethos of, shall I say, perfection, really had a deep influence on my father. And in addition to that, I think that he felt more of an intellectual kinship to Aunt Florence than he did to his own mother. So in that way, he developed a very, very close relationship with her his entire life. We have letters from him to her, starting from when he was 9 years old, up until the time that she passed away.
And this is wonderful material on the history of Bob's development, because he was very explicit with why he was forming the company and why he was doing this, why he was building synthesizers. It explains a mystery that those of us that looked at this history, he started to make cheap amplifiers in Trumansburg. One of the first projects it was the time of the Beatles, 1963. He was manufacturing these 63, 64, was he doing this? These cheap amplifiers. And Walter Serra in New York, who was his pal, would assemble these kits that came down from Trumansburg. And we wondered why. I don't think these were such high-quality amps. They were Beatles-type things. And in one letter to Aunt Florence, he actually says explicitly that I want to do research into sound, electronic sound, but also I'm going to I've got the company to do that, but I also need to support the company by selling other things. And this, I think, was one of the other things that he was doing. He made this very explicit in a wonderful letter to Aunt Florence. But before we get to Ivica Trumansburg, there's another important family person. Shirley Moog, his wife-to-be, enters the picture. So could you just say a little bit about how, because in the archive we found this incredible correspondence, a trove of love letters between Bob. He wrote to her sometimes 4 times a week when he was a grad student at Cornell, and she was down still in New York. So I wondered, do you mind saying a little bit about Shirley?
So, yeah, and we just, I should cover his education a little bit. So Dad went to, he applied to some of the Ivy League colleges. He was declined from a few, got into a few. He got into MIT, but could not afford to go because it was $2,000 a year, and his parents could only afford $1,000 a year. So he decided that he was going to do a dual degree program at Queens College and Columbia University, where he would get 2 degrees, one in engineering physics and one in electrical engineering, at the end of 5 years. So that's what he did, and during his time he was continued to be associated with Queens College even when he was studying at Columbia, and he belonged to a service fraternity. And my mother, who was 2 years younger than he was, belonged to a service sorority. And they had a joint party one night, and as my mother tells it, she and her friends agreed that this probably wasn't going to be that much fun. They were going to leave early. They were just going to be nice. And then when the appointed time came, my father had apparently walked in the door, and my mom changed her mind about it not being such an interesting place to be, and she wound up staying behind with Dad, and that's where their romance kind of started. And a year later, my dad was admitted to Cornell to get his PhD. And so they corresponded back and forth and visited back and forth over that year, and then they were married that summer.
Those letters are incredible because nothing seems to have changed. They complain about the transport. Bob is saying, it's so hard to get up here. Air flights are unreliable. The weather really is terrible. Snowstorm snowed in again. It's incredible, that correspondence. So he arrives at Cornell in engineering physics. And I suppose the interesting thing for me is that developing the Moog synthesizer doesn't seem to be so much connected to his PhD, which was on something to do, we've got that in the exhibit, on sodium chloride.
The ultrasonic absorption of sodium chloride.
Yeah.
Yes.
So my sense is that it's more from the hobbyist background of building Thermins, which in the letters to Shirley he's saying, got to build another Theremin. And he's still building these Thermins when he's up at Cornell as a grad student.
Yeah.
And developing the hobbyist side of things. And it seems that is the thing that's kind of driving this forward more than the PhD in engineering physics. That's the sense I get. Is that your feeling as well?
Well, I know that he was very devoted to the Theremin, and then that really changed even in 1961, which would have just been 3 years after they were married, and when he was, I guess, 4 years into his 8-year journey to getting his PhD, and that he created his first transistorized theremin, the Melodia, in 1961, which was incredibly successful and selling for $49. So they sold over 1,000 of those. And at that time, my father thought he would just be in the theremin business for the rest of his life.
Right, yeah. David, so you met Bob shortly after this period. Was he still a graduate at Cornell when you first met him?
He got his degree.
He'd got his degree, yeah. Because I remember these stories about him getting his degree. He was commissioned for John Cage, wasn't he? The Variations 5.
Oh, that's right. He had a
Premiership of it he was doing with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company.
Yes, he was hired by them to make objects that are very theremin-like to put on the stage, so that when the dancers got near them, they triggered certain things that the Cage musicians had figured out, because they were all electronic. They made their own unique electronic instruments in the pit. So he and John Cage worked every afternoon for a long time. So
Yeah, and he did his finished his PhD about that time. So it's amazing to think that he's finishing his PhD, but he's working also for John Cage.
We should really tell the PhD story, though.
Yes, you tell this. Yeah.
Yes,
Is this the elevator
Yes,
one?
yes.
Yes.
Yes. So
this is a good story.
Dad had a very prolonged relationship with his thesis. He arrived here at Cornell in the fall of 1957. He thought it would take 5 years to get his PhD. That would have been 1962. He did have to take time off, at least 1 6-month period, that he took a little sabbatical just to focus on the business, his growing theremin business at the time. You might imagine that his advisor, Dr. Henry Sach, got a little frustrated as time went on, and actually Aunt Florence did too. She took a very dim view of the fact that Dad was taking so long, and he was constantly defending himself in his letters to her. Finally, in the summer of 1965, Dr. Sach called my dad and said, he was German, I believe, he said, "Moch, whatever is not in your thesis by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," or
Monday morning, I thought it was, but I could have got this wrong.
now I've lost my train of thought.
What's never not on my desk.
I thought it's tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock is not in your thesis.
Yeah, that's right. It's not in your
So,
thesis,
as
that's
Dad describes it, he went to his office, he cleared everything off of his desk, and he sat all night and finished his thesis, which is amazing after 8 years, right? He finished it, he did it.
Yeah.
So then, he goes home at this point. My parents have 2 children, my older sisters, and to celebrate this momentous moment, they all walk over to the Dr. Sach's office building together. And
just in Clark Hall, I understand.
Clark Hall.
Which is still here.
And
physics is still in there.
Mom and Laura and Renee waited outside. So Dad comes into the building, gets onto the elevator. He must have felt so triumphant at that point, and relieved and happy. Unbelievable. He gets on the elevator. He, presses the button, and then he starts to listen to the cycle of the motor, and decides it would be fun to jump up and down to find the resonance of the motor, and he gets stuck for 4 hours in the elevator until they finally got him out. And Henry Sach, his advisor, was waiting for him at the elevator door, apparently, and was quite bemused. So it's just an example of Bob Moog's unending and insatiable curiosity about the world around him.
Yeah, incredible story. And so I suppose we should tell the story of him meeting Herb Deutsch, is very important in the history of the synthesizer. So he met Herb Deutsch. There's a dispute about where they actually met. This has been resolved, whether it was the Eastman School of Music or the Concord Hotel. And there was, Bob always insisted it was the Concordia Hotel, but Herb said it was at the Eastman School he thought they'd met the first time. And I think Herb was using the Theremin, and Bob was demonstrating Thermins. They met each other.
Yeah.
And Herb Deutsch, who's going to, by the way, be here as well on a panel on, I guess, tomorrow, Judith? Saturday. He's on a panel on Saturday, thank you. And Herb Deutsch was an experimental electronic musician using big oscillators at the time. And so there wasn't anything like the Moog synthesizer in existence. And he got into conversation with Bob about how it'd be useful if we could make these big oscillators more portable, more flexible, more affordable as well. And I think the story is Herb had a concert in New York City with the guy who made Jason Seeley, who's the statue is still outside the Statler Hotel of the Tin Man, as we sometimes call him. He was making these car bumper sculptures. The concert was people banging on these sculptures. Bob was invited down to record the event, as I recall, with his tape recorder, a tape recorder. And it was like a 60s happening type scene there. And Bob was suddenly exposed to this sort of interesting scene, the Fluxus movement in New York City, and was inspired by these conversations with Herb Deutsch, I understand. And Herb Deutsch then came up to Trumansburg one summer to work with him. And that's out of those conversations, the Moog Synthesizer was born, I do believe.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And they developed things like very simple oscillators. And I remember Herb Deutsch telling me that it would be good, Bob, if we could articulate attack, decay, and sustain, which is, of course, on every synthesizer since. And Bob said, I know how to do that. I'll just go across the road. He bought a doorbell, apparently. And that was the first attempt to give some sort of attack to the waveform. So he's developing these early modules with Herb Deutsch. And that was very, very important that they were working together. The musician, and this is the first of these incredible collaborations, which David is an example that Bob had with musicians. And I think that music background must have helped him meld with these musicians. That's my own take on it, anyway. And so they developed the Moog synthesizer in this period. 67, I think, is the first year, as I remember, the word synthesizer appears in the Moog catalog. So they're putting together these electronic music modules. It's very high-end gear. He went to the Audio Engineering Society. That's the first time I think he presented the Moog synthesizer. And these devices were not cheap then. I remember Bob telling me the cost of a small house if you had a decent tape recorder with it. So they were very, very expensive. And the idea was it was only people with academic institutions, independent studios that could buy the synthesizer in those early days. And that led across to the early modular synthesizer. The other thing I think we should tell, that I think is really, as a sort of a historian looking at this as a significance, is the fact that he had a studio in his factory in Trumansburg. And my understanding is this studio he had a seminar, a 3-week seminar for budding electronic musicians to come and try out the latest gear. He held this in Trumansburg. And as a result of that, they built the studio on the factory in Trumansburg. And that studio turned out to be so important because musicians could try out gear there, like David was composing, I think, in the studio. And also, I think you got lessons depending on how much gear you got. So the engineers were instructing musicians how to use this gear. But more to the point, they could see the main way the musicians were using the modular gear, which led to the Minimoog, which is a hardwired, simpler version with a portable keyboard of the big modular system. And Hemseth, as David said, who was working on the Minimoog, and Jim Scott, I think, got the idea of how to put those modules together, which were the crucial modules. Hemseth, yeah. The first two were by Bill Hemseth, the Min A and the B, as they're known as, the prototypes. And they got it from observing. So it's like he had a laboratory to observe how musicians from that studio were using gear, which is a very interesting thing to think about. That's how he got the idea. He was getting the feedback from the world of music in that studio.
Another thing to remember is that the keyboard was one of the last things that was added to that.
Right.
It used to be all sequencer control. And Herb Deutsch convinced him to add the keyboard.
Yeah.
And that became a very controversial thing later.
Because you didn't have to have a keyboard. Obviously, we had Don Buchler on the West Coast who built synthesizers without keyboards. And Bob had this controller. We have this in the exhibit called the ribbon controller.
Ribbon controller, so you could bend the tones. But that turned out to be a big selling positive for the whole thing.
Yeah. So, David, then, what were these stories we got to these stories you were going to tell earlier on? We interrupted you. We had to go for the early history. Tell us these stories about.
Well, when I got there
your
in
interaction with Bob.
1967, I got there in '67. I had no idea about any of this background or any of the stuff, and apparently had just finished, putting the modular together with all of the keyboard and the sequencer, and the studio itself. As I slowly learned, this was one of the best state-of-the-art studios anywhere in the world. I mean, really. It had tape recorders. It had extra things that people would bring in. Bode would bring in his ring modulator. He would bring in, someone would bring in a vocoder. And then they would bring in 4-track tape recorders was there, and 2 2-tracks, and people would bring in 8 tracks. And they actually worked on an 8-track for a while. And it was wonderful to be there, and you could use all of this stuff. I mean, it took me months to learn how to do it, but that was one of the main things there for me. So, but he was under great financial stress all the time, and I didn't realize that until maybe after the Minimoog was started, and they were working on Jim Scott was here. Jim
That would
Scott,
be in
you got there in
69 the start?
1969, didn't you? You get there in '69? Yeah. And Bill Hemseth invented the Minimoog, but he did it so that he could demonstrate what the synthesizer sounded like without using patch cords, because he realized after a while that putting all the patch cords in on the modular Moogs confused people, like it did me at first. I mean, people with no background in anything like that. So he made it so you could just push the keyboard down and twist a few dials and get very many different sounds. And that was his reason for building it. And then it became obvious that they needed something. And so I started using this synthesizer that Bill Hemseth made. It's now called the Model A, and it's on display at the Electronic Music Education. What is the name of it? And yeah, the Electronic Music Education and Preservation Project.
In Philadelphia, just
outside
outside.
of Philly.
Yeah.
It's in Pennsylvania, and it's a fantastic place. I mean, they have millions of dollars of, synthesizers, guitars, amp, everything you want. But anyway, it was a while, and he was under the stress all the time, and you know more about that.
But before we move on to stress, let's just say another key element of the modular Moog synthesizer, the sound, is the low-pass filter. So it's sometimes known as the ladder filter. And this would take out the higher harmonics of sound. And this is the only thing that Bob had a patent on,
Yes,
the synthesizer.
the only thing, if he had patented the pitch wheel, he could have been a millionaire. Buddy.
The pitch wheel is on the Minimoog, the pitch at the left there, and that is on every synthesizer since.
Yeah, he invented the pitch wheel and the modulation wheel. He invented lots of things you see on every synthesizer to this day. And he just couldn't afford to protect himself. So.
But the low-pass filter seems to be experimented and came up. I don't know we know the origins of where that came from, that low-pass filter. There's all sorts of rumors he'd worked for Raymond Scott at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah. But whether that was influential, we don't know.
And then there's the famous story of the low-pass. Is it the low-pass filter on the Minimoog that is miscalculated or something? That gives it that great sound?
The other story we heard about the Minimoog was that all the engineers had great ears. They were, could listen to the sound of it, and that was so important as well. So that's why it sounds so good. That's what I remember Bob saying this, that the engineers could listen.
But they didn't figure that out till later, what made it sound so good.
Yeah, and then there's a story about the power supply. One of the characteristic sounds of the Minimoog is why it sounds like a breathing instrument is that the oscillators roll through each other rather than lock. And that was, I understand, was because of the power supply being noisy, and they tried to fix the power supply and make it less noisy, and then they locked together. So in fact, keeping it noisy was the key to a beautiful sound.
Yeah, that happened in 1972.
Yeah.
Tried to upgrade the Minimoog.
Yeah. Yeah.
So after the Carlos success with that switched on Bach, and when rock and roll musicians started to buy modular Moogs,
The 68, Switched on Bach comes out, the
yeah, but they didn't
sensational
start
recording.
They bought the stuff maybe in '69, and when Keith Emerson started using it live, then they realized they had a performance instrument, and that's one of the reasons why they had to convince Bob to make a small synthesizer. He didn't want to. He thought it would take too many options away from people. And then Jim Scott and a couple of Jim Scott is here, by the way, and he had a lot to do with the way the Minimoog was developed. So, as I remember, the engineers finally cornered him when he got back from his many trips. He was always out of town. He was always trying to get backing. He had to give guest lectures and all that.
69 was the only year the Moog company made a profit, is what I heard.
Yeah,
that was the sales of, after success of Switched on Bach, which, by the way, is still the best-selling classical record of all time. So this was unbelievable, the sales of this. And so the recording industry, being the recording industry, thought the secret was you just had to have a Moog synthesizer on every recording.
That's right. And
so
all recording labels wanted their Moog album.
So they were selling modular Moogs like crazy that year, 69. And
I think they sold 50 modulars in 1969, which was a lot. If you consider that an average modular system costs as much as a small house.
Yeah. Switched on
and there were
Bach,
four-
switched on Bacharach,
Yeah.
switched on Country, switched on Santa.
There were 42 people working at the company at that point, so it was quite a production.
But by 1970, they convinced him to build one, and he said he wanted to build, just didn't want to build a small synthesizer, he wanted to build the Cadillac of small synthesizers. So it went through several different versions, and by late 1970 or so, they had the Model D, right? Or late summer. Yeah. And by 1971, they were starting to get lots of orders for Minimoogs, but they needed to borrow money to make them, and they were out of credit, and that's when they decided to. That's the hard decision, to move from Trumansburg to Buffalo to save themselves from bankruptcy, and Bob was sort of a slave of this guy, but she knows more about that than me.
Yeah, this is, well, he got bought out by a venture capital. But we should also talk about Shirley's role in the company. I want Michelle to say a little bit about that, because again, this is just coming out more in the last few years, what her role was in the company. So could you say a little bit about that, please?
Sure. My mom did the books for a long time, but over the course of the company changing from a Theremin production to a portable electronic musical system company, which is what they called the synthesizers before they were called synthesizers. Let's see, my eldest sister was born in 1961. My sister Renee was born in 1963. That's the year that Dad met Herb Deutsch. There was a 5-year gap, and then I was born in 68, and my little brother was born in 1970. So during that time, my mom did help take care of the books, and she was also involved in entertaining the musicians who came through the factory. She was quite an accomplished cook. She was a great entertainer, and she really enjoyed putting together dinners large and small. She also assisted with the 1965 seminar that Trevor referred to. That's what the studio was developed for, that event, but there were 13 visiting academics that came to, and musicians who came to learn how to use the modulars for 3 weeks, and my mom basically helped organize all the logistics for those seminar attendees and helped organize the food for a lot of their visit. And, you know, the other part of it was that Bob and Shirley Moog had 4 kids, and Bob Moog worked 7 days a week at R.A. Moog Co. So her role in the business was that she took care of the house and the kids so that Dad could work all the time. And I was telling David before we started that there was a period after Matthew was born in 1970. This is when sales of the modulars had gone up and peaked in 1969, and then they leveled. The sales dropped for a variety of reasons, But what happened in that time is the staff increased to 42 people, and my father really bulked up on inventory, thinking that these wonderful sales would continue. And he was caught in what we would call an inverse financial situation. And he very quickly got to be $250,000 in debt, which is about the equivalent of over $1.5 million in today's dollars. In any case, he was working all the time, which he had a tendency to do anyhow. My whole life, he was what we would call somewhat of a workaholic. But in that time period, in 1970, when things were in a very crucial juncture, he was working all the time, and my mom finally went to him and said, you're never home, and I've got 4 kids to take care of. I have no help. So I'm going to take the kids, and I'm going to move into New York City with my mom, and she's going to help me take care of the kids, and when you're ready for a family, you let us know and we'll come back. And she said, at that point, that got my father's attention, and he made the grand concession that he would only work a half a day on Sundays. And that was enough to keep my mom around. But part of what that feeds into is what David's talking about, the enormous pressure that he was under at that time to try to figure out how to save the company. And he was out a lot looking for investors and trying to see if he could get someone to help him on the business side of things.
And the guy who bought him out, we would today call him a venture capitalist, had seen that the nature of the electronic music instrument business was changing, because Bob was going to the AES, his Professional Audio Engineering Society meetings, where he would present, circuits about the synthesizer. They actually had a little commercial thing where he would sell modular synthesizers. But the place to go to sell synthesizers became the NAMM show. And then the new guy saw the importance of NAMM and that the Minimoog, and here there's a very charismatic Moog salesman, David Vancouvering, who's part of the story, who is separate from the Moog company and realizes that, hey, young musicians could buy this and that rock musicians could use the Minimoog in their bands. And this is the same time that prog rock is taking off with people like Keith Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Rick Wakeman of Yes are doing tours. Vancouver used to say you could see the sales of the Minimoog from whenever these bands toured. They'd get calls in from Chicago where Keith Emerson was playing. We need to buy Minimoogs. Where can we get them from? And so the new owner had seen that it was becoming more of a commercial venture, and the thing to do was build a sales network. And I don't know, is your impression that Bob's soul went a little out of the business at that point, when it became taken over by Norlin eventually, and which was part of Fender?
Yes.
Yes.
But it's more complicated than that. I mean, Bill Waitena was
Bill Waitena was the venture capitalist.
Was everything my father was not. He was a somewhat ruthless businessman, and he agreed to purchase the business for the amount of debt. So he wiped out the debt, which was significant. And my dad was very happy to have that debt wiped out. I think you're the one who told me he had a party, like I'm out of debt party.
Yeah. Tell us about that party, David. What was that like?
Well, it was just, it was his going away party. He was telling people he wouldn't be back and so on. And, and he was thanking us all for, our friendship and help. And I remember being at the company a few days before the guy came from the new company to count everything with people going in and out. He was like this guy who made sure you didn't take anything. So Bob said, there were 4 or 5 of us. He said, if you see anything in here you like, just take it. So we went around and took everything we wanted. He said it was with Bob's blessing, so.
So Bill Waitena took over the company, and he is the one who moved the company to Buffalo, New York. And I know my parents were extremely sad to have to leave this area. We lived in Trumansburg in a beautiful farmhouse on 55 acres of land. And my parents absolutely loved it here. They loved the beauty of this area. They loved the kind of laid-back, artful community that surrounded them. And they did not want to go to Buffalo, but off they went. And it should be noted that I think Bill Waytena had, at very best, a modest amount of respect for my dad. He really disapproved of my father as someone who could not maintain a business, because that was what Waytena was so good at. And so very quickly, my dad was moved off the main engineering floor and working on little side projects fairly quickly within the first couple of years of moving to Buffalo. And it wasn't too long when Norland did take over. My dad stopped going into the company and had what they called Norland Research Laboratories right behind our house. He detested going into the factory so much that he worked mostly from home at that point. And he was only there because he had to be there. He signed a contract to be there. But as soon as the day that contract was over, he left the company, which was the end of 1977. But as to answer your question, the way my mother would put it is that, so delicately, she said to me, Bill Waytena demasculated your father. So that was, the psychological effect of, it didn't have to be that way. I don't think, having the company taken over by someone else had to be that way, but it is the way it turned out because of the dynamic between Dad and Bill Waytena.
Interesting synthesizers did come out, though, of like the Polymoog we have in the exhibit. And
many more synthesizers came out during that period, yes.
Yeah.
Did he then go to Kurzweil?
Yeah, and then...
That was much later. That wasn't until 1984, the end of 1984, yeah.
So could you sketch us a little bit, just going forward in time, when he leaves the company, what happens then, and with his life and so on, and
sure.
what's he doing?
And it should be said that in those years between 1971, when the company was moved to Buffalo, to when my dad left in 1977, my dad was not highly involved in developing synthesizers, but many other people in that factory were, including Jim Scott, who developed the Micromoog and the Multimoog and probably others that I'm not aware of, but I'm sorry? Mainly those two.
Dave Luce, the Polymoog?
Yes, and many others. And there are many iconic synthesizers that did come out of that period that were kind of offspring of one sort or another of Bob's original work with the modulars and then the team's work on the Minimoog. But my parents decided that after this 6 or 7 year stint with Bill Waytena that they wanted no more of corporate life. And they, in the interim, in the early 70s, my dad had befriended a gentleman actually at a musical educators conference in Texas. He befriended a guy named George Kelichek, who lived in Brasstown, North Carolina, which was in the extreme western part of the state near Georgia. George was a wood instrument maker. He made cellos and violins and whistles, and he was a Polish guy who had immigrated here, and he was extremely good at what he did. And he and Dad really enjoyed each other, and he invited Dad to come visit one summer, and so as we went down as a family, and my parents just fell in love with North Carolina. And knowing that they were going to be leaving Moog Music at the end of 1977, they went back to North Carolina twice and subsequently bought 2 parcels of land. And the summer of 1978, we all moved to North Carolina. My dad basically cashed in his part of the shares of Moog Music, and which part of what they used to buy the land, and then they built their dream home, which was a kind of funky 15-sided Deltec round home on 89 acres. It was an absolutely exquisitely beautiful place to spend my personal formative years. I was there from 10 to 17. And just to give you an idea of the change, we went from living, in the suburbs of Buffalo, New York, down to Leicester, North Carolina, which is 20 miles out in the hills outside of Asheville, where, people would venture up our third of a mile long driveway because they had heard we had a rotating house. In any case, when we first moved down there was nothing on the property. We moved into a 100-year-old log cabin on the property that had no running water, no electricity, no windows. This was in the middle of the summer, so it was kind of like cabin camping. We got our water from the stream behind the cabin, and my parents rented a porta-john, and we basically camped for the entire summer, which was amazing because as a family, we went from hardly seeing Dad to being with him all of the time. It was, a piece of family heaven those few months, and he was really focused on getting the house built. And he coordinated all of that, from the grading of the land to the pouring of the foundation, the septic tank being put in, and he is the one who found the two springs on the property that we would eventually get our water from. And he really embraced this new place in his life. And just to go back a little bit in his youth, he was a very active Boy Scout and almost Eagle Scout. He really enjoyed nature from the time he was a little kid, and that came back into play when he was finally liberated from his corporate position. So that's what he was doing for about a year and a half. He did establish Big Briar Incorporated as soon as we got to North Carolina. The reason that it was called Big Briar, it was named after the property. The name of the property that we lived in was Big Briar Cove. But the reason that he had to rename his business is because part of his agreement with Norlin, which was a company that took over Moog Music from Bill Waitana in 1973 or 74, part of his agreement was that he was no longer able to use his own name. So if he was going to start a new business, it had to be under another name, and he started Big Briar. And eventually, after the house was built, Big Briar did go into operation. I was going to say full swing, but that may be a little optimistic. The goal of Big Briar was to make custom electronic musical instruments, which was really my dad's passion. My dad's passion was not manufacturing thousands of the same synthesizer. My dad's passion was doing one-offs. It was problem solving. It was sonic discovery. It was, solving one challenge after the other. I know that I've heard Jim talk about this, and that's also what may have been a little bit of his downfall when in the early years of his company. But he did start Big Briar, and he was making custom electronic musical instruments, which we can get into if you want. But he started consulting at that time. He was writing for Keyboard Magazine at that time, even earlier than that actually. But he did quite a bit of writing during that time. So he was kind of piecing together an existence, carving out a new place for himself, if you will.
Right. And he also interacted with Kurzweil at this period, or was that slightly later?
It's a little bit later. So we're talking about, we moved in 78.
Yeah.
Kurzweil wasn't we didn't move until 84. I think he started working for them a couple of years prior. Yeah. What Trevor is referring to is my dad would do some consulting for other synthesizer companies. He consulted for a company called Krumar, which was an Italian-based synthesizer company. And he also consulted for Kurzweil, which was an up-and-coming synthesizer company that was doing quite well. And at this point, as the cycles with my dad tended to go, he had been in business on his own for 6 years and was out of money because he was in business but not succeeding at the business part, not at the bottom line. So he was using all of his savings to fuel the business, and then he ran out of money. And this time he had 4 kids getting ready to go through college, and he needed some kind of steady income. So Kurzweil offered him. They were based in Boston. They offered him a job as the vice president of new product research. And in December of 1984, when I was in the middle of my junior year of high school, we moved up to Boston.
That must have been a change.
Yes.
Isn't it true that Ray Kurzweil looked on Bob Moog as one of the great inventors, and he looked upon him as a mentor, actually, an inspiration?
When we had the event at the Smithsonian to celebrate Bob, Ray Kurzweil came and made a speech about Bob to that effect that he was. And so this was a fantastic endorsement by Ray Kurzweil, who's an interesting guy in his own right, of course.
Yes.
Ray Kurzweil, one of the great inventors himself.
Yeah. So you're in Boston, and then you go back to North Carolina. Jumping ahead, I met Bob Moog in the 1990s. He didn't have the right to use his own name then. I remember interviewing him down in Big Briar, Nashville. And you'd go, this is the early days of the internet, whatever search engine. It wasn't necessarily Google then. There were other search engines, believe it or not, as you will remember. And you put in the name Moog, and it wouldn't be Bob's company that would come. It would be other people manufacturing Moog synthesizers. And so eventually, he won the right back to use his own name. Right.
Yeah, that was quite a bit later. So what happened is he had
I'm trying to move us along.
Yes,
Sorry.
he had a 5-year contract with Kurzweil. He and my mother, because all the kids were in college at that point or out of college, returned to North Carolina in 1989, and my father revamped Big Briar. He was making Theremins. And then he began making Moog, which are small synthesizer components or foot pedals, in 1998. And what Trevor is referring to is there was a point where the Moog Music Company had actually closed down, and years prior. And there was a point that the Moog name came up for renewal with the trademark office, and I don't think my dad was really paying attention to any of that, and someone else grabbed it. And this guy, his name is Don Martin, started making Minimoogs under the Moog name, but unfortunately they were not very good quality. And that really got my dad's attention. When someone started making something that was not very good quality with his name on it, that really bothered him. And that's when he decided it was time for him to try to get his name back. And he had to sue this guy and use a considerable amount of his savings and mortgage the house in order to get his name back. And during this time also, he had split up he divorced, my parents divorced in 1994, and my dad met somebody else and remarried in 1995. But in any case, he had to fight to get his name back, and he eventually did in 2002. And in that time, he had also been working on an updated version of the Minimoog called the Voyager. And it just so happened that he got the name back right around the time the Voyager was ready to go into production.
Yeah. And around that same period, greater recognition also came because he won this important prize, the Polar Prize, which most people don't know about, but the Polar is actually ABBA's studio in Sweden, and they sponsor the Polar Prize, and it's like it's a big deal. It's a Nobel Prize for music, actually. That's what it is. And he won it with Stockhausen and Burt Bacharach, I do believe.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
An incredible trio of people.
He looks so happy.
Yeah. And then there was also the technical Grammy around that time as well, which Stephen Jobs won for the Apple computer.
Yep.
Bob won it for the Minimoog and its contribution to music. So these are starting to be really big deal recognition that's coming. But it's interesting. People who were in the electronic music business all knew about Bob, of course, and people who used the instruments. But he was sort of, I think, moving to a greater level of recognition at this period of his life, late in his life, as it turned out tragically to be.
Yeah, he had definitely developed an iconic status.
You go there, people would line up to meet him and sign stuff.
Yes,
I
which he
remember.
never really understood. He was very, very humble, and I think the fame actually, made him uncomfortable. He was more of a he didn't really like things that were exclusive, and he didn't embrace the notion of celebrity. So that whole he never really understood it. And at one point, actually, much later after my dad passed away, a friend of his told me a story that during this period, my dad went to this guy named Craig Anderton, who some of you may know. He's a very accomplished music technology journalist and a guru himself. And Dad went to him, and he wasn't sure about putting all this time, money, and energy into getting his name back, and he wasn't sure it was the right thing to do. And I don't think he appreciated the weight of the Moog name still carried. And so he said to Craig, as someone in the industry and had his finger on the pulse of these things, he said, Craig, do you think that the Moog name still has any value? And Craig said to me, Michelle, I'm sorry, but I just had to turn to your dad and say, Bob, are you stupid? And of course, we all know Bob's not stupid, but it does speak to his level of not being intrinsically connected to the fame and the iconic status. That was not really where his interest was. It wasn't where his own self-identification was either.
You told me this amazing story. I remember when we first met at Columbia University, we had that memorial thing for Bob, and you told me this amazing story, which was that when he won the Grammy, he didn't hardly mention it to his family at all. He'd won this technical, which is amazing.
He didn't.
I would have been right saying, "Hey, kids, I won a Grammy." But
my stepmother made him. She's like, "Bob, you have to call them and tell them." He's like, "Why?" And that was just. And I remember when I was a kid, and I'll go through this quickly. We lived in Massachusetts. And this is when Dad was working for Kurzweil. And I go to school, I'm a teenager, right? I'm like, junior, senior in high school. And I go to school, and the kids, some kids who like never talked to me before because I was like the new person that nobody really understood. They're like, we heard about your dad on the radio. We heard about your dad on the radio. And they all listened to a different radio station than I did, like this rock station, and I listened to something else. And I was like, why was my dad on the radio? And they're like, yeah, he won he got a star on the Rock Hall of Fame. I was like, he did? This is not the first time I learned about something. And so I didn't believe that he would have won that and not told us. So I went home after school, I get off the bus, I go march myself right into the house, call information, ask for the number of the radio station, and I called them and I said, someone told me they heard this on your radio station. Is this true? And they're like, yeah. So then I proceeded to go downstairs to my dad's very modest office and start poking around. Of course, Dad's at work. It's like 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And sure enough, on the filing cabinet, under, like 4 papers and some mail, I lifted up, and there with a little layer of dust on it is, this star from the Rock Hall of Fame and made out to Bob Moog. So that's just in 1970, my dad got the New York State Small Businessman of the Year award, which I understand actually the business manager at Moog Music kind of helped arrange to raise the profile of the company when they were struggling. But he got this award at the same time that he was $250,000 in debt and about to lose business. And there is a picture of him receiving the award, and he looks so cynical. And he would always say about these kind of things, he would say, Michelle, it's all just a crock of shit.
yeah, that's right.
And it's not that, I think he liked the recognition, but as I was saying, for him, the recognition was not what was important. It was the work that was important.
And the overwhelming, we're going to open it up in a bit, but there's a really important part that I want to talk about. The overwhelming love for Bob Moog and for his instruments really came through in his passing. Yeah. This was an amazing thing. There was a website dedicated to comments, and I remember it was on that website every day. And there was just like literally thousands and thousands of comments from people just expressing. It was unbelievable. Here's an electronic music manufacturer who's, people really loved his instruments and loved him as a person. It's an incredible outpouring. So the question I have for both of you, so what was it about, is it the instrument, the man, the combination that led to this incredible attachment? It wasn't just like going to buy another Korg synthesizer. These Moog synthesizers really meant something to people owning them. And you tell us.
You go first.
What that was about.
Well, as a person, he was very unassuming, and you knew he was a genius, and he didn't come off as one, personally, but you knew he was, and he had a great sense of humor, and you never got the feeling that he was trying to sell you something. That's probably why he didn't make that. He's a great businessman. But, I mean, he was just this great, very generous person. And I remember, I don't know, it must have been about 5 or 6 or 7 years before he died, he called. I had all of the original Moogs that I used, and I had stored them with a friend of mine who was an engineer, because the humidity in his storage place was very good, and in mine it was very bad. So Bob contacted him to ask him if he could ask me, and then he asked me himself if I was still using one of the modular Moogs. And I said no. And he said, do you mind sending it back to me? And this is something I spent a lot of time, anyway, it was expensive, and I had spent many times playing lounge piano, but I was a jazz pianist, trying to pay for it. And I immediately said yes, he could have it. It's because he was so incredibly generous as a person that I had known for so many years, and he gave me anything I ever asked for, and he was always great to me. So it's that kind of quality, if you knew him at all, that yes, you would give anything to him that he asked for, because he never asked for anything that you couldn't give him. It was that kind of person. He was just a wonderful man. Really? He must have been. Yeah.
Yeah, when I was interviewing Jim and Bill Hemseth, Bill said to me...
By the way, that synthesizer is in the Cornell collection now. That's the modular Moog. It has Mother Mallard.
You can see it tomorrow if you come to the opening exhibit. It's right at the front.
So, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bill said to me he was the best boss I ever had. But he also kind of qualified it and said, it wasn't quite like a boss situation. He was one of the team. He wasn't so hierarchical. But if I were to answer the question why, I think it's multifaceted. I think that part of it is, in a lot of ways, not always, but in a lot of ways, Moog was first. So they were the first synthesizer that people remembered hearing. Moog synthesizers were the ones that were responsible for birthing people's awareness of an expanded sonic universe. And a lot of people connected to that on a very deep level through the music. I might say particularly through progressive rock, which was very popular in a certain period. And I meet a lot of people whose very identities and formative years are very attached to that music where brand new things were happening. So I think that's one reason that people feel so connected to him. The other one is because he was such a humble guy, and a lot of people were able to meet him, talk to him, or somehow know him over his 50-year career. And it's funny when people come up to me and say, I met your dad in London, I met your dad in Chicago, I met your dad in LA, and I met your dad in New York City, and I met your dad 4 times, and here. And I was sitting there going, oh yeah, that's where he was all those years of my childhood. It's actually been quite good for me because, as a kid, you wonder why your dad doesn't spend time at home. As an adult, to figure out, oh my God, of course, there's this huge, brilliant reason why Dad wasn't around. For me, it's been it was a revelation, because my dad never really talked about his work. But I think there's also that somehow people connected to that humility, but I think it's either in the Moog movie that's been out for many years or somewhere else. My dad says, I think that people connect to me through the circuits. And he certainly felt like he was connected through the circuits. And as ethereal or cosmic as that may sound, I think there's something to that. And because Dad's intentions were so pure in just wanting to give people the highest experience of sonic exploration, that's what came through those instruments. Both that he built and that his team helped develop. And people can sense that there's something special about a Moog instrument. And even though many people worked on Moog instruments, the heart of that whole ethos is how my dad started in 1963 and 1964 building those synthesizers. And I think that's what helps him stand out.
Yeah. So we're going to open this up now to questions, comments for floor, people who have memories of Bob. I know there's various musicians here who've worked with Bob, and any questions for our panelists. And we're going to go for a bit anyway with questions, comments. Maybe, yeah, the back there. Could you mind using the microphone? I think we're recording. Yeah.
Hey, so when you did your lunchtime talk today, the thing that was just exploding in my head that I wanted to know about was the Sun Ra visits in '69, when Sun Ra and the entire orchestra showed up. If you have any memories of that firsthand or secondhand, or any stories about how that actually happened.
You know, I think maybe Jim would be even better. I was only a year old, and I've heard about it, and I've heard that it, like, the whole town of Trumansburg was talking about it. But
Can I
Jim,
give you the mic?
do you know anything about that?
I wasn't a party to that, but I heard about it from eyewitness
there.
John Weiss.
Oh,
Was-
David was there, yeah.
Apparently he showed up in several vehicles, a whole troop of people, and they had quite a discussion with our composer in residence, Chris Swanson, in front of that building right there.
What's that?
In front of the factory.
I was there when Sun Ra was there, and I was one of the ones who demonstrated the modular Moog to him, and it was like, that didn't go very well. And so we demonstrated we had minis around at that time. We had a Minimoog.
The B. The B.
The
yeah.
B, maybe.
Which he
We
took
just-
down to New York City, right? That's the one he
and,
took.
And I showed him that. He was interested in that. And it turned out he really didn't know how to control it, but he would turn the knobs and so on, and anything that sounded strange was fine with him. And he had an entourage. People I met, and they introduced themselves. One was a painter, one was a poet, and one was a singer, I think, and several other people. And Bob took them all out to dinner all the time, and I think they were there for like 2 days. And when they left, the thing I remember, which I thought was very funny, that none of their checks went through. They all bounced. But I didn't know that till later. And Bob went around and just cheerfully paid all the money for them and never said anything, and gave him a Minimoog B. That's why everybody loves Bob, too. So, and Bob would go to his concerts in various places, and they all agreed that, yes, they liked what he did. It was the strangest sort of stuff they did. So it was a world of difference between what Sun Ra did with his Minimoog and what Chris Swanson, who was the official sort of composer in residence at the RA Moog Company, who would do very precise things and have Bob evaluate and change certain things on the pitch wheel and so on. So yeah, that was funny, yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned Chris Swanson, because I was wondering a little bit more about his history. I know he went out to Wisconsin again, and then I guess he died. But he put out 2 records that were done in the studio, I believe. And I actually plugged them into Amazon the other day, and they've never heard of him.
Well, that's strange. Chris Swanson was a jazz composer who was very good, and he ended up in the 80s. He won a Grammy with that great alto player. What's his name? I can't hear you. Bill Woods.
Yeah.
Bill Woods, who
Yeah.
married Charlie Parker's widow. He was very good, and I was in touch with his wife and his son, and they worked with someone else, and they put out Pulaski Skyway is the name of it, and they've taken his 2 albums and combined them into one on a CD, and they've reproduced it, and it's available. I thought it was available. They sent it to me.
Well,
I still
maybe
have
they
it.
didn't know what I was asking for.
Huh. I'll look at the label on it when I go home, and I will.
And when I visited in the studio, Chris Swanson played, he had done a version of God Bless the Child. And it was just amazing. I couldn't believe the synthesizer could do something like that.
In the exhibit, we have pictures of Chris Swanson at the Museum of Modern Art, that concert in 1969, which was a famous concert where one of the first live Moog concerts in New York City. And Chris Swanson had a band there. John McLaughlin was in the band, and there's some beautiful pictures in the exhibit of Chris. And his wife, Meg Swanson, is a famous knitter, by the way. I've had correspondence with her, sending her pictures of Chris. So it's a very interesting story, this kind of the jazz thing. And he was the chief studio musician for a while.
He was a composer in residence.
Composer in
Yes,
residence.
at R.A. Moog.
Yeah, composer in residence.
I was the night guy who worked for nothing. I was more like Bob.
My little Moog story is I was trying to be a volunteer producer at Pacifica Radio in New York. And my brother-in-law had moved up to this area outside of Trumansburg, and he went to work for Moog. He was some kind of engineer with him, knew a lot of electronics. But he pulled a couple of strings, and I was able to come up with a tape recorder and try to do an interview with Bob, which would play on the air in New York City. And it did. This was about 1969. And I remember Bob and I sat in a booth in Kostrub's Luncheonette, which is in that picture.
Yeah.
And we did the interview, and he was extremely shy. I don't think he had done a lot of interviews at that time. And he kind of explained the nuts and bolts of what a synthesizer does, and I thought it was interesting. I've since listened to, I still have a portion of it. It's pretty boring. But the other thing that happened, from his shyness, Bob kept clearing his throat, and I had to do an awful lot of edits on the tape, because otherwise this constant throat clearing would have been quite annoying to the listener. I left in a few, but just to give you the sense of it. And it was so gracious of him to speak to this non-entity 23-year-old out of New York City and do an interview for the radio. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to a little piece of history that hasn't come out yet. Bob actually taught a course at Cornell in the fall of 1970 and spring of 1971. I was fortunate enough to attend both those courses. I want to get to that, back to that in a minute. Michelle, I want to say congratulations for on the new museum. I hope to come down and visit sometime. I hope to win the raffle next year, too.
There are pamphlets for the Moog Museum right here if anyone wants to grab one later.
What did he, was he teaching in electronic engineering?
Well, it's interesting. It was the School of Electrical Engineering, Phillips Hall. And in fact, I first met Dave there. Dave doesn't know who I am, but anyway, I know who he is. And get to that also in a minute. But very quickly, the fall of 1970 course was primarily electrical engineering, having to do with the production of electronic music, and was interesting to me as an electrical engineer at the time. But also he would mix in a lot of references to musical genres and ways that the synthesizer might be used in production of various types of music. The spring of 1971, the course was quite different, and I remember this because it was actually a new and very interesting thing to me personally, was psychoacoustics, or the perception of sound, was the main focus of that particular course. And we went into a lot of description of how things work psychologically, and also masking effects and all this sort of stuff, which actually anticipated a lot of the psychoacoustic mechanisms that are important for digital compression techniques that came to the fore, were developed 25 years later. So he was not only ahead of his time, but he really understood the subject deeply, which was kind of a surprise. The other comment would be that he was very unassuming. This obviously is a characteristic that we've heard about quite a bit this afternoon. I knew about switched on Bach, but I really didn't at the time understand how well known Bob was in the world of music, and his really extensive fame even at that point in time. He was very unassuming in class. He was very focused on what he was doing. He seemed to be, even though he might have been doing this as a financial fill-in during that period, he seemed to enjoy teaching, and I enjoyed his course.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Eric Ross is sitting there. I know you've got some, has worked with Bob Moog. Is there a story, we have to wrap up soon, Eric. You'd like to share here? Just one.
Thank you. Yeah, I had worked with Bob. I'm a theremin player, and I had worked with Bob in the 90s. I did a week-long workshop with him up in Portland, Maine at a theremin festival up there. And CBS and NBC and ABC news networks all came to visit this theremin workshop and festival. And I remember the crew came in, and one of the guys had kind of knocked over one of the students' theremins that they were working on, and it broke. And Bob got down on his hands and knees and was helping the kid fix it and get it back together. Meanwhile, these crews from ABC and NBC and CBS are there waiting to interview him. He didn't care. He was more interested in helping this kid get the things together. He was a very interesting and a generous individual. It's really an honor and a privilege to have met him and known him. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think time has caught up with us. Just like to remind everybody before I thank our panel participants and you all that 8 o'clock in Sage Chapel today, there's going to be live electronic music performances by Kevin Ernst and students at Cornell, and invite you all to that. Events kick off tomorrow at 3:30 again? 3:30 tomorrow, here in this same place, same location, so please come for that. And I'd like to give Michelle and David a round of applause for sharing with us. Thanks for all coming out on a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Mm.